Europe, 1914. Tensions between the great powers had been building for years. Britain and Germany had been in an arms race to build the biggest navy with the new top ship, the Dreadnought. France and Germany, then known as Prussia, had a big war, and France surrendered, and they lost some land, and now they want it back. And lots of the Balkans have been declaring their independence from the nearby empires with help from Russia. Europe was a ticking time bomb ready to explode into war. This is Franz Ferdinand, and this is his wife, Sophie. They're going on a trip to Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia, which was recently annexed by Austria-Hungary. The people there weren't too happy about this annexation, because they wanted to join Serbia. So Franz was going there to cheer them up, and also to open a state museum and look at some military maneuvers. As he was driving through the streets, things were relatively normal until some people in the crowd pulled out bombs. They were assassins. Thankfully he got lucky and the bombs missed, but they actually blew up some officers in the car behind him. So like the smart guy he was, instead of leaving Sarajevo to safety, he went to the hospital to visit the injured soldiers. But the popular explanation is, his driver took a wrong turn and he ended up next to one of the failed assassins who was getting a sandwich. His name was Gavrilo Princip, and when he noticed that the Archduke was right there, he shot him and his wife dead. The Austrian government suspected that Serbia had something to do with this. So, on the 28th of July 1914, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum of demands to Serbia. When Serbia refused these demands, Austria-Hungary declared war. Germany had an alliance with Austria-Hungary, so they also declared war on Serbia. Italy was in on this alliance, but they decided to stay out of the war for now. But Serbia was by no means alone, as they had Russia as their ally. And Russia was allied with France. And France was sort of allied with the UK, but they too decided to stay out of it for now. And finally Montenegro decided to join the war with Serbia. By now most of the major European powers were involved in the war, and so Germany was quick to make the first move. Their plan was called the Schlieffen Plan. It basically said, while Russia is still mobilizing, invade France at lightning speed, then send all our troops to Russia and invade them and win the war. However, there was a problem. France had put all its defences on their border with Germany, so Germany couldn't waste any time trying to get through them. The solution to the problem was simply to go round through Belgium. On the 4th of August 1914, German troops entered Belgium. But whoa! Said the UK. Invading neutral countries, aren't we? Guess we'll just have to join the Allies. The Germans continued their advance into Belgium and eventually made it into France too, steadily making their way to Paris. Unless something could be done, it looked like the war was already lost for the Allies.
Joseph Joffre,
or as his troops like to call him, Papa Joffre, had an idea. So far they'd mostly been retreating from the Germans, so he said, "Whoa, where do you think you're going? The Germans are over there. Turn yourself around, dig a trench, and wait for them to come to you." Now, this new strategy did manage to slow down the German advance. However, it introduced an entirely new problem: trench warfare. There was now trenches running all the way from the English Channel to Switzerland, causing a front-wide stalemate. This is how trench warfare works. There are two lines of trenches with no man's land in the middle. The objective was to overrun the opposing trench with your troops. However, this proved difficult, as no man's land was full of craters, mud that could swallow you whole, and barbed wire. Not to mention that your trench could be bombarded by artillery for days on end, and that as you tried to cross no man's land, machine gunners will be firing at you the entire way. Just living in the trenches was bad enough itself, with widespread disease and the psychological torture from knowing that at any moment your trench might be overrun, or that you'd have to go over the top yourself and face near to certain death. Many who survived the war never truly recovered from what they'd seen. It was a true horror of war. As all this stuff in Belgium and France had been happening, Russia decided to make their move, and charged into the north of Germany and Austria-Hungary. They started off quite well, but things turned around at the Battle of Tannenberg, where the entire Russian Second Army was wiped out or surrendered, and the German army started pushing back until they got stuck just like on the Western Front. Austria-Hungary hadn't been doing too great either. So far they hadn't really managed to make any advances into tiny Serbia, and they'd failed to push Russia out of their territory. By now it was coming to the end of the year, and what was expected to be a short and quick war had become a total stalemate on all fronts. Neither side was really getting anywhere with the current stalemate, so they decided that the best way to win the war would be through new fronts. Africa had been full of lots of native tribes, but then the Europeans came along at the Berlin Conference and divided it up between themselves. Now it looked like this, and when the war broke out it looked like this. I think we can see where this is going for the Germans. Yoink. Although it looked relatively quick on that map, it lasted a good duration of the war, and many of the Africans native to those areas were enlisted and died for another country. In East Asia, the Australians took the German colonies of German New Guinea, Nauru and Samoa, while the Japanese took all of this for their new empire. Back in Europe, the Central Powers' new friend was the Ottoman Empire, a struggling empire in the Middle East. They'd even come to being known as the sick man of Europe after a long decline. Initially they didn't know whether to join the war or not, but a few things happened and some Ottomans who wanted to join the war went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and they were in. Their first move was to invade the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. The soldiers found the mountains quite cold, and when Russia's best ally, the winter, set in, most of them died from the cold, and they abandoned all the land gains they'd made. They also tried their luck against neutral Persia and the British in Egypt, but both of these ended in failure, and they also retreated from here. Good old Winston Churchill then said, well, they're not doing so great, let's open up a new front which they won't be able to defend in the Dardanelles. With 490,000 Anzac and French forces, it ended in total disaster, with a total of over 550,000 dead on both sides. The Allies also had a new friend in Europe. It was Italy, who had abandoned their original alliance with the Central Powers when the Allies offered them some stuff. They attacked Austria-Hungary in the mountains, but they got stuck just like everyone else. 1915 and 1916 saw lots of changes in the way the war was fought. Germany started Zeppelin air raids on British and French cities. The Second Battle of Ypres saw the first use of chlorine gas by the Germans, who also began unrestricted submarine warfare, which aimed at destroying British merchant ships and Allied navies. Speaking of the Navy, in 1916 the only and major sea battle of the war happened, where Britain and Germany's fleets faced off and a good portion of each was sunk. Planes which had been used for reconnaissance flights were fitted with weapons, and the first dogfights of history took place. The British invented the tank, which saw its first use at the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme was started in response to the French cry for help, who were desperately trying to defend the city of Verdun. The Somme aimed to draw German reinforcements away from Verdun, which did work, although the Somme suffered 60,000 casualties on just the first day. Russia had been getting pushed back further and further into its own territory, and so in response to the French cry for help, they began the Brusilov offensive, which was extremely effective, but eventually it slowed down and they got stuck. Just before this happened, the Central Powers enlisted the help of Bulgaria, so they could finally knock out Serbia and Montenegro, in time for 1916. This year, the Allies got themselves some more helping hands, from Portugal and Romania, who, seeing how well Russia had been doing, attacked Austria-Hungary, though their advances were quickly undone. By now it was 1917, and all the European fronts had come to a standstill again. There were mutinies in the French and Austro-Hungarian armies. A British naval blockade meant Germany couldn't eat, and Russia's resources were dwindling. After what is known today as the National Schism, Greece joined the war on the side of the Allies, and opened a new front in the south. Still not much had changed, and finally it was Russia's breaking point. Riots and strikes broke out in the city of Petrograd. These eventually evolved into the Russian Revolution, which saw Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks take power and pull Russia out of the war. This was fantastic for the Central Powers, who now grabbed as much land as they could, and now only had to focus on the Western Front. Romania, surrounded, also surrendered. All hope was not lost, however, as the United States joined the war. You see, atrocities in Belgium committed by the Germans greatly swayed public opinion against them. In addition, unrestricted submarine warfare meant the Lusitania was sunk, a British ocean liner with 159 Americans on board at the time of the sinking. The final straw came when Germany sent a telegram to Mexico. The telegram never reached Mexico because the British intercepted it and showed it to America, but it proposed that they join Germany and invade the United States in order to reclaim some of the land that they lost in the Mexican-American War. The US posed a real threat, and so Germany knew it was now or never. They would have to defeat the Allies before American troops arrived. They began the spring offensive and hit hard at the Somme. They continued to hit hard further north, but it was no use. With each hit, they spent more and more of their resources. With American troops now arriving in the millions, they simply couldn't hold on to the gains they'd made. They fell into a retreat, and that was that. The Central Powers were being pushed back on every front. Bulgaria was the first to surrender, then the Ottomans, followed by Austria-Hungary, and finally, on November 11, 1918, Germany surrendered, with 22 to 23 million killed on both sides. Now that the war was over, it was time to deal with the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary essentially collapsed and formed all these new nations. The Sèvres Treaty divided the Ottoman Empire up, leaving it with very little land. Other demands of the treaty included reducing its army to 50,000 men and its navy to 13 ships. After several years of fighting for their independence, they managed to establish the Republic of Turkey and get their old land back. Bulgaria was the least affected by their treaty. They lost very little land and had to pay very little reparations compared to the others. Finally is the Treaty of Versailles. Germany lost all of their overseas colonies to the Allies. In Europe, their homeland was divided up and given to neighboring countries, and a region that was left, the Rhineland, had to be demilitarized. Other terms of the treaty said that they accept the war guilt and they pay £6.6 billion to the Allies in reparations. This would lead to a Great Depression worldwide, which would ironically allow for a certain Adolf Hitler to rise to power in Germany. Despite being with the Allies, Italy didn't actually get everything they were promised. This ironically would act as a sentiment which allowed another fascist dictator to rise up. Among other things, that revolution in Russia ultimately created the Soviet Union. After their huge contribution to the war effort, women were finally given the vote in the UK. And finally, huge medical advances were made with blood transfusion, surgery, X-rays, and eventually a deeper understanding of mental conditions. Thanks, Gavrilo.